What is Lincoln-Douglas debate? So first we're going to talk about what LD stands for, what at its core LD is, and then we're going to be talking about some of the more finer points of how LD works, what you talk about, and some of the more basics of LD. So first, what does LD stand for? Well, LD stands for Lincoln-Douglas debate. LD is an abbreviation of Lincoln-Douglas. And the name comes from the debates between Abraham Lincoln and Stephen Douglas. Abraham and Stephen participated in a series of debates while they were running for Senate in, I believe, 1858. They were both running for the Senate seat, and they decided to hold a series of debates so the people could better understand which candidate they wanted to vote for. And so what was special about these debates is they focused on one of the major issues of the day, slavery, and specifically they focused on the morality of slavery, on whether intrinsically it was right or wrong to hold people as slaves, as opposed to the policy or economics, as opposed to should we allow it to continue through the Western territories or just limit it to states where it is, or is it economically beneficial to have slaves as opposed to industry or workers doing the work as opposed to slaves. It focused on the morality as opposed to the policy or economics of slavery. Alright, so in Lincoln-Douglas debate, you're going to be debating a resolution. The league that we compete in will give you a resolution at the beginning of the year, and throughout the year you'll be debating and arguing and discussing about that resolution. Now the resolution is usually going to compare the worth of two options. So resolution we had this past year was developing countries ought to prioritize economic growth over environmental protection. So it was the debates were about comparing the worth of economic growth and environmental protection. Which one is better to have, economic growth or environmental protection? Another one was in formal education, liberal arts ought to be valued above practical skills. So that was comparing liberal arts and practical skills in education, and we discussed which one turned out better and which one helped students the most. Another part about Lincoln-Douglas debate resolutions is they're about what ought, not necessarily what is. The debates that you're going to be having aren't always going to be rooted in fact. They're going to be rooted in usually universal truths. It's much more philosophical than other forms of debate like policy debate. In policy debate, you have to show what is happening and what is going to happen if you pass your plan. Whereas in Lincoln-Douglas, you're much more philosophical and arguing about more generalizations, morality, things like that. Finally, the resolution provides boundaries for the rounds. You should only be talking about what the resolution talks about. If you're debating liberal arts and practical skills, you shouldn't be talking about whether we actually went to the moon or not, or genocides in Rwanda, or things like that. You should only be talking about what the resolution talks about, because if you don't, then there's no way to tell who won the debate round because you never talked about the resolution. So you should only talk about things that are under the resolution. So value debate. Lincoln-Douglas is a value debate, and it's heavily focused on values. Now, a value is an ideal. It's something that is good. And the way a case works, a little bit of the structure of a Lincoln-Douglas case is the affirmative team comes up and says, the resolution is good because it upholds my value of X. Prioritizing economic growth over environmental protection is good because it upholds societal progress. And the negative might come back and say, no, the resolution isn't good because prioritizing economic growth over environmental protection hurts my value of human life. So that's the way the values work in a debate round. There's something that's good, and affirming or negating the resolution should lead to each side's value. Now, value should be something that is lofty and yet achievable. Like societal progress, that's a good theme. Society progressing is good. It leads to better healthcare, more advances in technology and medicine. And it's very lofty, but it's also achievable. We can progress society. We can protect human lives. We can protect human rights. We can achieve justice. It's something that's lofty and good and yet achievable. Finally, a value functions as the highest possible good, and around a value should be something that nothing can go above it. And that's good because if nothing can go above it and your side of the resolution supports your value, that means that because your value is the highest, your side wins. Because you achieve and uphold the highest possible good, your value. Alright, so teams. Lincoln Douglas, there are two teams in a Lincoln Douglas debate round, the affirmative team and the negative team. The affirmative team must support the resolution and their values. Like I said before, the affirmative has to say the resolution is good because when we prioritize economic growth over environmental protection, it leads to my value. They have to show how supporting the resolution leads to their value, and they have to show that their value is the best. That's the affirmative team's job. Now, the negative team must argue against the affirmative. They have to show how the affirmative isn't doing their job, how the affirmative doesn't show their value is the highest, or the affirmative doesn't show how upholding and affirming the resolution leads to their value. That's the job of the negative team. They can also negate the resolution, say the resolution isn't true because the resolution hurts my value of human life or whatever your value is. That's another way the negative has to do it, but the negative must argue against the affirmative and show that the affirmative is wrong. Now, each team in Lincoln Douglas debate has one person on it. It was just Abraham Lincoln against Stephen Douglas, and so it's just one person against one person in Lincoln Douglas debate. The term Lincoln Douglas actually usually means that it's just one person on each team. Like there's team policy debate, it's teams of two people policy, and then there's Lincoln Douglas value debate, one person against one person debating values. Alright, so tournament setup. So when you go to a Lincoln Douglas debate when you go to a Lincoln Douglas tournament, you're going to be competing there, but there's a few things that you have to do before the tournament actually begins. So, that's the structure of a round. So, few things you have to do before a tournament. First of all, you have to have cases prepared for each side. You can't just stand up at the beginning of the round and just start talking about something. You need to have a case prepared so you just read off your case. It's very easy to do that, and it also allows you to do a lot of research and study into this topic before you go into the debate round. You need to have cases prepared so you can just read your case and then argue based off of your case. So you need to have a case prepared for each side, an affirmative case and then a negative case, and then you also need to have some other research on the topic, maybe backup arguments if your second contention is something like prioritizing economic growth provides societal progress. You'll obviously talk about that under that point of your arguments, but you'll also want to have other examples showing how to use later in the round, showing how your side is the correct side. Some just pre-written arguments so you don't have to spend prep time wasting it, things like that. And then you also want pens and pencils and briefcases to write stuff down during the round and keep track of the arguments you make. And so this is how a Lincoln Douglas debate round flows, how it works. First of all, there's the affirmative constructive. So in that speech, the affirmative debater just comes up, reads their case that they've prepared ahead of time. That's 6 minutes. And then the negative and the affirmative conduct cross-examination. That's where the negative is going to come up and ask the affirmative debater questions about the case that they just read, maybe some other things relating to the resolution. So that's 3 minutes of cross-examination. And then the negative takes some prep time to prepare for their speech that they're about to give. And the negative and the affirmative both have 3 minutes total of prep time, and they each have 2 times where they can take prep time. The negative takes prep time after the affirmative constructive and after the first affirmative rebuttal, and the affirmative takes prep time after the negative constructive and after the negative rebuttal. So it's a bit confusing, but as you start actually competing in debate rounds, it becomes much easier to keep track of the flow of what's coming up next, who's doing cross-examination, who's taking prep time, things like that. So negative takes some prep time, and then the negative comes up and gives a 7-minute speech, And in this speech, the negative will usually read his or her own case of to why the resolution is wrong or why it's false. And then they'll also want to respond to the speech that the affirmative just gave. So if the affirmative said, my value of justice is the highest value, then the negative could come back and say in their negative constructive, no, my value of human life is the best value because XYZ. The negative needs to argue against the speech that the affirmative read in their constructive, and this is their only opportunity that they're going to have to make arguments against that speech. And that's important because if you don't argue against what your opponent has said, then you agree to it. Because in the judge's mind, they're told they think, well, they didn't make an argument against it, they didn't have anything to say against it, so they obviously can't think of anything to say against it, so it's obviously a correct and right argument. That's what the judge is going to think at the end of the round. Hey, he didn't talk about this, so he must agree with it. So the negative needs to read their own case and respond to the affirmative case. How I usually structure it is my negative case is about 3 to 4 minutes, and that leaves me about 3 to 4 minutes to respond to the affirmative speech. So then there's cross-examination. The affirmative comes up and asks the negative questions, and then the affirmative takes a bit of prep time, and then the affirmative has 4 minutes to respond to a 7-minute speech. That's often the hardest speech of the debate round because you have so little, you are using 4 minutes to respond to 7 minutes of speaking time. You have to respond to the negative case, and you have to defend your case. It's a very hard speech to do, but after the affirmative rebuttal, the negative comes up and takes the rest of his prep time. If he used a minute during his first section, he can take 2 minutes now. And then the negative comes up and has his negative rebuttal, responds to what the affirmative said, and then he also gives voting issues. Basically, he says, these are the main arguments in the round, and I win these arguments. I win this round, judge. You should vote for me based on the fact that my value is the highest. I showed the resolution is wrong. My opponent is wearing a bow tie, and he's wearing glasses, and his glasses aren't clean. Those are, don't use those as voting issues, but that's just to show how the voting issues are the reasons why you want the judge to vote for you after the round ends. So the negative comes up, gives a 6-minute rebuttal, and then the affirmative takes the rest of his prep time, and then the affirmative gives his or her last rebuttal, and it's 3 minutes. So in this speech, you're not going to have time to respond to everything the negative just said. You want to respond to maybe 1 or 2 big arguments, and then you want to give your voting issues. Say, judge, at the end of the round, you should still vote for me because I win on these arguments. That's how you want to spend your last affirmative rebuttal, just responding to 1 or 2 main arguments and then giving your voting issues. All right, each speaker, and so the way the round is structured, each speaker gets a total of 13 minutes speaking time and a total of 3 minutes of prep time. So while the affirmative gets to speak both first and last, the affirmative speeches are shorter than the speeches that the negative gives. The negative has 2 speeches in the middle of the round, but he gets more time in those speeches to expound upon his arguments and explain it a lot more. It's a very good balance of the affirmative goes first and last, but the negative gets more time to explain his or her arguments. All right, so that's just an overview of what LD is, how an LD round works, and the important parts of LD.